The dust kicked up from Samuel's horse settled around him like a shroud as he crested the ridge overlooking the valley below. The Oregon Trail stretched endlessly before him, a ribbon of hope carved through the wilderness by countless wagons and desperate dreams. He had been riding for 3 days straight, his jaw set with determination, his mind focused on reaching independence before the last wagon train departed for the season. Time was running out, and with it, his chance to start over in California. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the prairie, painting the landscape in shades of gold and amber. Samuel pulled his hat lower over his eyes, squinting against the glare as he urged his horse forward. The silence was broken only by the rhythmic clip-clop of hooves and the occasional whistle of wind through the grass. This was frontier country, where a man could disappear without a trace, where the past held no power over the future he chose to build. As he descended into the valley, something caught his eye near a cluster of cottonwood trees by the creek. A wagon sat motionless, its canvas cover torn and flapping in the breeze like a wounded bird. Samuel's instincts, honed by years of survival on the frontier, immediately went on alert. Abandoned wagons usually meant one of two things: Indians or disease. Neither was something a wise man approached without caution. He slowed his horse to a walk, his hand instinctively moving to rest on the butt of his Colt revolver. The wagon appeared to be a standard prairie schooner, the type used by families heading west. But there were no oxen in sight, no campfire, no signs of recent habitation. The eerie stillness of the scene made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. Then he saw her. A woman sat on the wagon's tailgate, her black dress stark against the weathered wood. Her head was bowed, hands folded in her lap, as still as a statue carved from grief itself. Even from a distance, Samuel could see the dejection in her posture, the way her shoulders curved inward as if trying to protect herself from the world. Samuel approached slowly, his horse's hooves crunching on the dried grass. The woman didn't look up, didn't acknowledge his presence. As he drew closer, he could see she was young, perhaps no more than 25, with auburn hair pulled back severely under a black bonnet. Her dress was well made, but travel-worn, and the mourning garb told him everything he needed to know about her recent circumstances. "Ma'am!" Samuel called out, his voice carrying the gentle authority of a man accustomed to command. "Are you in need of assistance?" The woman's head jerked up, her eyes wide with startled fear. They were the color of summer sage, beautiful despite the exhaustion etched around them. For a moment, she looked ready to bolt, like a deer caught in an open meadow. Then, something in his expression must have reassured her, because she relaxed slightly, though her hands remained clenched in her lap. She began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what to do." The admission seemed to cost her, and she looked away, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. Samuel dismounted, moving slowly to avoid startling her further. "Where's your party? Your husband?" "Dead," she said simply, the word falling between them like a stone into still water. "The fever took him 3 days ago." "The others?" She gestured vaguely toward the trail ahead. "They couldn't wait, said they had to keep moving before the snows came." Samuel felt something twist in his chest. He'd seen plenty of hardship on the frontier, but there was something about this woman's quiet dignity in the face of abandonment that stirred something protective in him. The wagon train had left her behind, alone and vulnerable, with winter approaching and hundreds of miles of dangerous territory between her and civilization. "What's your name, ma'am?" he asked, his voice gentler now. "Elizabeth," she replied, finally meeting his eyes. "Elizabeth Harper. And you?" "Samuel Collins." He touched the brim of his hat. "Mrs. Harper, you can't stay here. This territory isn't safe for a woman alone." Elizabeth's chin lifted slightly, a spark of defiance flickering in her eyes. "I'm aware of that, Mr. Collins, but I haven't many options available to me." Samuel studied her face, seeing the intelligence there, the strength beneath the grief. A plan began forming in his mind, crazy and impractical, but perhaps the only solution that made sense for both of them. The sun, was beginning its descent toward the horizon, and decisions made at sunset had a way of changing everything. The dying light of day painted the sky in shades of crimson and gold as Samuel busied himself gathering firewood. Elizabeth sat exactly where he'd left her, watching his every movement with the wary attention of someone who had learned not to trust easily. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken questions and the weight of desperate circumstances. Samuel had seen that look before, in the eyes of soldiers who had lost everything in the war. It was the expression of someone who had been forced to rely on themselves for so long that accepting help felt like admitting defeat. He understood that feeling more than she might imagine. "Tell me about your husband," Samuel said as he arranged the kindling, his voice carefully neutral. Sometimes it was easier to talk about the dead than to face the living problems sitting right in front of you. Elizabeth's hands stilled in her lap. Thomas was a good man. A shopkeeper from Boston, he had dreams of opening a store in Oregon City, said there was opportunity there for those willing to work for it. Her voice caught slightly. He wasn't built for the trail, but he was determined, that he wouldn't let his family starve in the city when there was land to be had in the West. "You have children?" Samuel asked, though he had already scanned the area and seen no signs of them. "We did." The words came out as barely a whisper. "Margaret was 6, little Thomas was only 4. The fever took them first, then my husband." She pressed her lips together, as if holding back a flood of grief that might drown them both. "I buried them beside the Platte River, 3 graves in a row, like stepping stones to heaven." Samuel felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came with hearing about senseless loss. He'd buried his own dead, knew the particular hell of standing over fresh graves while the world continued spinning as if nothing had changed. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it. "The wagon master, Mr. Branson, he said they couldn't wait for me to recover. Said the snows would trap us all if we didn't keep moving." Elizabeth's voice hardened with remembered hurt. "They gave me 3 days to grieve, as if you could measure sorrow like coffee beans or flour." Samuel struck a match, the flame dancing in his cupped hands as he lit the kindling. "Branson's not wrong about the snows. This late in the season, every day counts." He looked up at her, studying her face in the growing firelight. "But that doesn't make abandoning a woman right." "I'm not your responsibility, Mr. Collins," Elizabeth said, lifting her chin with a pride that reminded him of his sister back in Virginia. "I don't expect charity from strangers." "Good," Samuel replied, settling back on his heels as the fire caught, "because I wasn't planning on offering any." He pulled jerky from his saddlebags and offered her a piece. "I was thinking more along the lines of a business arrangement." Elizabeth accepted the jerky but didn't eat it, turning it over in her hands instead. "What kind of business?" Samuel had been wrestling with this idea since he'd first seen her sitting on that wagon tailgate. It was crazy, impractical, and probably the most foolish thing he'd ever considered. But sometimes, the foolish choice was the only one that made sense. "I'm heading to California," he said. "Got a claim waiting near Sacramento, but there's a problem. The land office won't register it to a single man. They want families, people who'll stay and build communities, not drifters who might move on when the gold runs out." Elizabeth's eyes narrowed. "And you think I should help you lie to the government?" "I think we both need something the other has," Samuel said carefully. "You need protection and passage west. I need a wife to satisfy the land office. Doesn't have to be real, just legal enough to get the paperwork signed." "Marriage of convenience," Elizabeth said, the words tasting strange in her mouth. "I've heard of such things, but I never imagined—" "It's not uncommon on the frontier," Samuel continued. "People do what they must to survive. We'd both get what we need, and when we reach California, we could go our separate ways. No strings, no expectations beyond what serves us both." Elizabeth was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. Samuel could almost see her weighing her options, few as they were. A woman alone on the frontier had precious few choices, and most of them were worse than the devil's bargain he was offering. "Why would you help me?" she asked finally. "You don't know me. I could be a murderer, a thief, a woman of questionable morals." Samuel smiled slightly. Could be, but I've seen murderers and thieves, and they don't usually sit quietly by their husband's grave wearing widow's weeds. He grew serious again. Besides, I've got my own reasons for needing to disappear into California. Let's just say I'm not running towards something so much as away from it. Elizabeth studied his face in the firelight, seeing the shadows there that spoke of secrets and regrets. What did you do? Nothing I'm proud of, Samuel replied, but nothing that would put you in danger either. I give you my word on that. The fire crackled between them, sending sparks up into the darkening sky. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, and Elizabeth shivered despite the warmth of the flames. The sound reminded them both of how alone they were, how vulnerable in this vast wilderness. If I were to agree to this madness, Elizabeth said slowly, what would you expect of me? Samuel met her eyes steadily. To be my wife in name only, long enough to get us both to California safely. Nothing more, nothing less. The sun touched the horizon, painting the world in shades of amber and shadow. Elizabeth Harper looked at this stranger who had appeared like Providence itself, offering her a chance at survival, wrapped in the dangerous promise of a false marriage. Tomorrow, she would have to decide whether to trust him with her life. Tonight, she would pray for the wisdom to choose correctly. Dawn broke cold and gray over the prairie, with Elizabeth waking to the sound of Samuel breaking camp. She had slept little, her mind churning with the impossibility of her situation. Through the night, she had listened to the distant howls of wolves and the closer sounds of Samuel keeping watch, his presence both comforting and unsettling. We need to move, Samuel said without preamble as she sat up, her black dress wrinkled from sleeping on the hard ground. There's weather coming, and we've got company. Elizabeth followed his gaze to the eastern horizon, where dust clouds marked the approach of riders. Her heart jumped into her throat. Indians? Worse, Samuel said grimly. White men with bad intentions. He was already saddling his horse, his movements quick and efficient. Pack only what you need. We leave the wagon. I can't just abandon everything, Elizabeth protested, looking at the wagon that held the last remnants of her old life. Thomas's tools, our wedding china, my mother's Bible. Samuel's hands stilled on the saddle cinch. For a moment, his expression softened as he looked at her. Ma'am, I understand what those things mean to you, but things can be replaced. Your life cannot. He gestured toward the approaching dust cloud. Those riders aren't coming to invite us to Sunday dinner. Elizabeth felt tears prick her eyes, but she forced them back. She had done enough crying. Moving quickly, she grabbed her small traveling bag and stuffed it with her few remaining precious items. The Bible, a daguerreotype of her family, Thomas's wedding ring. Everything else would have to stay behind. Can you ride? Samuel asked, leading his horse toward her. I can manage, Elizabeth replied, though her hands shook as she accepted his help mounting behind him. She hadn't ridden since she was a girl, and never astride like this. The impropriety of the situation, her arms around a stranger's waist, her skirts hiked up, would have mortified her a week ago. Now it seemed insignificant compared to staying alive. Samuel spurred his horse forward, and they rode hard across the prairie. Elizabeth clung to him, feeling the power of the animal beneath them, the rhythm of hooves against earth. Behind them, the dust cloud grew larger, and she could make out individual riders now. Samuel, she said, her voice barely audible over the wind. Who are they? Bushwhackers, he replied grimly. Men who prey on travelers. Take what they want, leave no witnesses. He urged the horse faster. There's a trading post about 5 miles ahead. If we can reach it. The words died in his throat as more riders appeared on the horizon ahead of them, cutting off their escape route. They were being herded like cattle, driven towards some predetermined destination. Samuel pulled up short, his horse dancing nervously beneath them. What do we do? Elizabeth whispered. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, his mind racing through possibilities. Then he turned to look at her, his eyes intense. Do you trust me? Elizabeth stared back at him, this man she had known for less than a day, who was asking her to place her life in his hands. Something in his expression, a steadiness beneath the urgency, made her decision. Yes, then hold on tight, and when I tell you to, scream like your life depends on it. Before Elizabeth could ask what he meant, Samuel was spurring the horse forward again, but this time toward a rocky outcropping that offered some shelter. As they rode, he began shouting at the top of his lungs, his voice carrying across the prairie. "Elizabeth, my wife, hold on, darling." The word wife rang out clear and strong, and Elizabeth felt a shock go through her. It was the first time anyone had called her that since Thomas died, and hearing it from Samuel's lips felt both foreign and strangely natural. "Now!" Samuel shouted, and Elizabeth found herself screaming, though she wasn't sure why. Her voice joined his in a cacophony that echoed off the rocks. The riders were closing in now, their faces becoming visible, hard men with cruel eyes and weapons drawn. Elizabeth could smell the danger coming off them like smoke from a fire. Whatever Samuel was planning, it had better work. As they reached the shelter of the rocks, Samuel quickly dismounted and helped Elizabeth down. "Stay behind me," he ordered, drawing his revolver, "and keep screaming. Make them think you're terrified." "I am terrified," Elizabeth admitted, but she understood now. He was trying to make her seem like a helpless victim, to catch their attackers off guard. It was a dangerous gamble, but it was the only card they had to play. The riders surrounded their hiding place, their horses snorting and stamping. Elizabeth pressed herself against the rock wall, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. Samuel stood protectively in front of her, his gun steady in his hand. "Well, well," called out the leader of the group, a bearded man with cold eyes. "What do we have here? A loving husband protecting his pretty wife." Samuel's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. "We're just travelers, mister. Don't want any trouble." The man laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Trouble's already found you, friend. Question is how much you're willing to pay to avoid it." The leader of the bushwhackers dismounted slowly, his spurs jangling with each step. Elizabeth could see the cruel calculation in his eyes as he looked her up and down, taking in her mourning dress, her obvious vulnerability. Samuel's grip on his revolver tightened, but he was outnumbered 6-1. "Name's Jake Morrison," the bearded man said, as if they were being introduced at a church social. "And you folks are trespassing on my territory." He gestured broadly at the endless prairie around them. "There's a toll for passage through these parts." "How much?" Samuel asked, his voice steady despite the impossible odds. Morrison's smile was like a wolf's grin. "Everything you got. Your horse, your guns, your money." His eyes lingered on Elizabeth. "And maybe we'll discuss terms for the lady." Elizabeth felt ice water run through her veins. She had heard whispered stories of what happened to women who fell into the hands of men like these. Behind Samuel, she pressed herself smaller against the rock, her hand finding the small derringer hidden in her skirts. Thomas had insisted she carry it, though she had never imagined she would need to use it. "The lady is my wife," Samuel said, his voice taking on a dangerous edge, "and she's not part of any negotiation." Morrison laughed. "Your wife? Well, ain't that touching?" He turned to his men. "Boys, we got ourselves a genuine love story here. Husband willing to die for his bride." "Samuel," Elizabeth whispered, her voice barely audible, "there's something you should know." But before she could finish, one of Morrison's men called out from the ridge above them, "Jake! Company coming!" Morrison's head snapped up, his hand moving to his gun. "How many? Looks like a cavalry patrol, maybe a dozen men." Elizabeth felt Samuel's body relax slightly beside her. Cavalry meant law, order, protection. But Morrison's reaction was not what she expected. Instead of concern, his face showed calculation. "Well now," Morrison said, his voice taking on a different tone. "Seems we got ourselves a situation." He looked directly at Samuel. "You wouldn't happen to be the Samuel Collins that Captain Henderson's been looking for, would you?" Elizabeth felt Samuel go rigid beside her. Whatever secret he had been running from, it had just caught up with them. She saw the recognition in his eyes, the way his shoulders squared as if preparing for a blow. "Don't know what you're talking about," Samuel replied, but his voice had lost its certainty. Morrison's grin widened. "Oh, I think you do. There's quite a reward on your head, Collins. Dead or alive, though. I hear the captain prefers alive. Something about a court-martial and a firing squad." Elizabeth's mind raced. Samuel was a deserter, or worse. The man she had been considering trusting with her life was a wanted criminal. But even as the thought formed, she remembered his gentle treatment of her, his protection, his willingness to help a stranger. "Here's what's going to happen," Morrison continued. "I'm going to turn you over to the captain, collect my reward, and your pretty wife here is going to come with me as compensation for my trouble." "Like hell," Samuel snarled, raising his gun. "Wouldn't do that if I were you," Morrison said calmly. "My boy's got you covered from 3 directions. You fire that gun and your wife dies first." Elizabeth felt everything slowing down around her. The approaching hoofbeats of the cavalry, the tension in Samuel's body, the cruel satisfaction in Morrison's eyes. In this moment, she had to make a choice that would determine not just her fate, but Samuel's as well. "Wait," she said, stepping out from behind Samuel. "I have a proposition." Both men turned to look at her, surprise evident on their faces. Elizabeth Harper, grieving widow, frightened woman, was gone. In her place stood someone harder, someone who had nothing left to lose. "I'm listening," Morrison said, intrigued despite himself. Elizabeth lifted her chin, her voice steady and clear. "A bride's ransom. Let my husband go, and I'll pay you triple whatever reward the army's offering." Samuel turned to stare at her. "Elizabeth, what are you doing?" She met his eyes, seeing the confusion there, the questions. "What I have to do," she said simply, "to save my husband's life." The word husband hung in the air between them, and Elizabeth realized that somewhere in the past day, the lie had become something closer to truth than either of them had expected. Morrison's eyes lit up with greed at Elizabeth's offer, but his expression quickly turned suspicious. "Triple, you say? What makes you think a widow woman's got that kind of money?" Elizabeth reached into her traveling bag with deliberate slowness, aware that 6 guns were trained on her. Her fingers found what she was looking for, a small leather pouch that clinked softly with the weight of gold coins. Thomas had been more successful than most people knew, and she had sewn the family's savings into the lining of her corset before leaving Boston. "My late husband was a careful man," she said, holding up the pouch so the gold caught the morning light. "He believed in being prepared for emergencies." She opened the pouch, letting several coins spill into her palm. "There's more where this came from." Morrison's eyes fixed on the gold, like a man dying of thirst, seeing water. "How much more?" "Enough to make you rich," Elizabeth replied. "But only if you let us both go. Try to take it by force, and you'll never find where the rest is hidden." Samuel watched in amazement as Elizabeth negotiated with their captors. This was not the frightened widow he had found beside the trail. This woman had steel in her spine and cunning in her mind. But he could also hear the approaching hoofbeats getting closer, and he knew their time was running out. "Elizabeth," he said quietly, "you don't understand what you're doing. They'll kill us both once they have what they want." "No," she replied, her eyes never leaving Morrison's face. "Because Mr. Morrison is a businessman, aren't you? And a smart businessman knows that word spreads on the frontier. Kill us after taking our money, and no one will ever trust you to honor a deal again." Morrison was wavering. Elizabeth could see it. The gold was tempting, but so was the guaranteed reward from the cavalry. Behind them, the sound of approaching horses grew louder. They had minutes, maybe less. Besides, Elizabeth continued, pressing her advantage. "What happens when the cavalry gets here and finds you holding a wanted man? They might start asking questions about your other activities. A man in your line of work probably prefers to avoid military attention." That struck home. Morrison's face darkened as he considered the implications. "You're a clever woman, Mrs. Collins. Too clever for your own good, maybe." "Collins!" The shout came from the ridge above them. Captain Henderson and his patrol had arrived, blue uniforms stark against the morning sky. "Samuel Collins! By order of the United States Army, you're under arrest for desertion and dereliction of duty." Morrison's hand moved to his gun, but Elizabeth stepped forward quickly. "Captain!" she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the rocks. "Thank God you've come. These men were trying to rob us." Henderson's sharp eyes took in the scene below. The bushwhackers surrounding the couple, weapons drawn, the obvious tension. "Morrison," he said coldly, recognizing the outlaw leader. "Should have known you'd be involved." "Now hold on, Captain," Morrison said, forcing a smile. "We were just having a friendly conversation with Mr. and Mrs. Collins here. No harm done." Elizabeth felt Samuel's surprise at her quick thinking, but she pressed on. "My husband and I were traveling to California when these men attacked us. If you hadn't arrived when you did," she let her voice trail off, playing the part of the grateful, frightened wife. Henderson dismounted, his hand resting on his saber. "Collins, you're coming with me. There's a court-martial waiting with your name on it." "Begging your pardon, Captain," Elizabeth said, stepping protectively in front of Samuel. "But my husband is not the man you're looking for." "Ma'am, I appreciate your loyalty, but Samuel Collins is wanted for abandoning his post during the Battle of Cedar Creek. Good men died because of his cowardice." Elizabeth felt Samuel flinch behind her, but she held her ground. "You're mistaken, Captain. This is my husband, Thomas Harper. Samuel Collins was my late husband's business partner who died of fever on the trail. We buried him 3 days ago." The lie came so smoothly, so convincingly, that even Morrison looked surprised. Elizabeth reached into her bag and produced Thomas's ring, slipping it onto Samuel's finger in full view of everyone. "Thomas was with me when we left Independence, Captain. We have papers, witnesses. This man saved my life after my first husband died. We were married yesterday evening by a traveling preacher." Henderson's eyes narrowed as he studied Samuel's face, clearly uncertain now. Elizabeth held her breath, knowing that everything depended on the next few moments. Samuel's life, her own future, their fragile hope of reaching California, it all hung in the balance of her desperate gamble. "Prove it," Henderson said finally. "Show me your marriage papers." Elizabeth's heart hammered against her ribs as Captain Henderson waited for the marriage papers she didn't have. The silence stretched like a taut rope ready to snap, with Morrison's men shifting restlessly and Samuel's fate hanging in the balance. She could feel the weight of every eye upon her, but her mind raced with the clarity that came from having nothing left to lose. "The papers," she said slowly, her voice trembling with what she hoped sounded like grief rather than desperation, "were in our wagon. When those men attacked us, everything was scattered. Thomas and I barely escaped with our lives." She gestured toward Morrison's gang. "Ask them. They'll tell you how they chased us from our camp." Morrison opened his mouth, but Elizabeth continued before he could speak. "The ceremony was performed by Reverend Mackenzie from the Methodist Mission. He was traveling with the Williamson party heading to Fort Kearney. You can verify it there, Captain." Henderson's weathered face showed the internal struggle of a man trained to follow procedure, but faced with a situation that didn't fit neatly into military regulations. Elizabeth watched him carefully, reading the doubt in his eyes. She had bought them time, but not safety. "Captain," Samuel spoke for the first time since the soldiers arrived, his voice steady despite the danger. "I understand your position, but my wife has been through enough. She lost her first husband and children to fever, and now this attack. Surely you can see she's telling the truth." Elizabeth felt a surge of gratitude for the way Samuel played his part, supporting her story without overselling it. But Henderson wasn't convinced yet. "Remove your hat," the captain ordered Samuel. Samuel complied, revealing hair that was longer than military regulation, weathered skin that spoke of months on the trail rather than recent desertion. Elizabeth had noticed these details without realizing their importance. Time and hardship had changed Samuel's appearance enough to create reasonable doubt. "The Samuel Collins I'm looking for has a scar above his left eyebrow." Henderson said, studying Samuel's face intently. "Battle wound from Shiloh." Elizabeth's blood turned to ice. She could see the thin white line Henderson was looking for, barely visible, but unmistakably there. Samuel's hand moved instinctively toward his face, then stopped. "Thomas has a scar, too," Elizabeth said quickly, reaching up to trace the line with her finger. It was the first time she had touched Samuel's face, and she felt him start at the contact. "From when he fell from a ladder in his shop. Told me it was the clumsiest thing he'd ever done." Her voice softened with manufactured fondness. "He was embarrassed by it, always trying to hide it under his hat." The intimacy of the gesture, the way she touched him like a wife would touch her husband, seemed to convince Henderson more than any papers could have. Elizabeth let her hand linger on Samuel's cheek, feeling the roughness of his unshaven jaw, the warmth of his skin. "Satisfied, Captain?" Morrison interrupted, clearly anxious to conclude this encounter. "Because I'd like to get back to my own business." Henderson's attention shifted to the outlaw leader. "Your business being robbing innocent travelers." "Now hold on," Morrison began, but Henderson cut him off. "I suggest you and your men ride out now before I decide to investigate your recent activities more thoroughly." Morrison's face darkened, but he knew better than to challenge a cavalry patrol directly. "This ain't over," he said quietly, his eyes promising future trouble. "We'll be seeing you folks again." As Morrison and his men rode away, Henderson turned back to Elizabeth and Samuel. "You'll need to come with us to Fort Kearny for verification of your story. Protocol demands it." "Of course, Captain." Elizabeth agreed readily. "We're grateful for your protection. The frontier is no place for honest travelers these days." As they prepared to leave with the cavalry escort, Samuel helped Elizabeth mount his horse, his hands lingering on her waist longer than necessary. "That was either the bravest or the most foolish thing I've ever seen," he whispered. "Maybe both," Elizabeth replied, settling herself behind him. "But you're alive, and that's what matters." As they rode toward Fort Kearny, the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. Elizabeth wrapped her arms around Samuel's waist, feeling the solid reality of him, the life she had fought to preserve. Behind them, their abandoned wagon grew smaller in the distance, along with the last remnants of her old life. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold. In the growing twilight, Elizabeth Harper had become someone else entirely. She had called Samuel Collins her husband, and somehow, in the space between lie and truth, it had begun to feel real. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers. But tonight, as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Elizabeth allowed herself to believe that sometimes the most beautiful futures grew from the ashes of the most devastating losses.